Hello everyone, so I've been quite sick the past week, and that means I didn't have the opportunity to go see Ari Aster's much anticipated third film, Beau is Afraid, which just released. However, I took the opportunity, being bedridden with nothing else to do, to go back and watch Ari Aster's first two films, Hereditary and Midsommar. Both films are quite polarizing in their own rights, and while I loved Hereditary on the first watch, Midsommar was definitely something that needed to grow on me, and after the second watch, I can rightfully say it grew on me quite a bit. Now, not only do I enjoy Midsommar, I can't stop thinking about it. There's a lot of interesting themes and ideas I'm looking forward to discussing, but as always, it's up for interpretation, so please don't take this as an end-all be-all. If you have different opinions or perspectives, just leave them in the comments below, and I would love to discuss. As well, if you want to help grow the channel, leave a like or subscribe for future content. Without further ado though, let's dive into the breakdown. So this movie's been out for a few years now, but I should say spoilers ahead just in case, because this is a movie you should absolutely see with no knowledge or expectations going in. That being said, I'll do a quick plot synopsis just to keep it fresh in your mind for those who have seen it. Following the murder-suicide of her sister and parents, Dani, still grieving, goes on a last-minute trip with her boyfriend Christian and his friend group. They go to this secluded commune in Sweden, and things start to get stranger and stranger, slowly realizing they have very outdated and extreme cultural traditions. It turns into a nightmare trip. One by one, the group is taken out until eventually Dani is the only one left, joining the community in a big ritual sacrifice. Simple enough, but this movie is so interesting to me because it's 2.5 hours of pure emotional dread and intensity building over that time. The more we are stuck in this isolated environment, we start to feel for the situation of the characters, or at least Dani, as it becomes more and more out of her control, being heavily drugged up and almost don't know what's real and what isn't, or the reality of the situation. Ari Aster leaves the ultimate intentions of the Hargas ambiguous until the very end to leave the viewer in the same position as the characters, confused, scared, and just wondering what's going to happen next. To add to that point of isolation, not only are we feeling that through the Hargas and this remote community, but arguably the entire film takes place in isolation through Dani's perspective. Despite being surrounded with other people, her boyfriend even, she's completely and 100% alone. This film gives us a look at toxic relationships, and director Ari Aster himself said that this was made after a breakup.
I was actually going through a breakup when I was writing the film, and instead of just, picking through the ruins of my relationship, I was able to,
write a dark horror genre movie?
Yeah.
Dani, clearly dealing with some mental trauma, some form of anxiety, depression, or PTSD at the least, is continuously talked down to and ignored. I've seen this common argument online about Christian and the morality of everything, and well, yeah, I mean, they all got murdered, that's obviously not good. It's also not the point to be focused on. It is a horror movie after all. I just can't see a justification of Christian as a person. He is through and through just not a good person. He's a shitty and manipulative person straight up. The whole friend group really is all shitty, but one of the main themes of the film for me is centered around Christian. He drives forth the entire plot. Dani was clearly in a bad relationship with Christian from the beginning, but with the tragedy of her family, Christian felt obligated to keep the relationship going. However, it makes things even more toxic because anytime Dani brings up any kind of emotional discussion, it's immediately shot down. Anytime Christian is pressed about his shitty actions, he's forcing the victim card and manipulates Dani into feeling bad and even apologizing for stuff she didn't do. This is all a very realistic representation of what a toxic relationship could look like. This feeds into one of the main messages of the film on emotional neglect and the longing to be understood. Dani doesn't receive any support from anyone. The only person she has at home from what we see is Christian, and he doesn't offer support of any kind. So when we look at the Hargas and their cult, as it seems, they look at Dani as someone easy to manipulate and coerce due to her emotional instability. She of course does get coerced, and while it makes for a very entertaining cult story, I also found it extremely fascinating to watch from the other perspective that we get to see Dani finally emotionally connect with a family of sorts and realize there are people out there who are willing to feel her emotions, who are willing to listen to her, and who represent this feeling of warmth. And so in the climax, it leaves a feeling of discomfort and confusion as a viewer, since how are we meant to feel? The film leaves on this almost triumphant note with Danny finally finding a home and a community, a family you could even say, but at the same time, is it a good feeling? Knowing what the community has done and what Danny was willingly okay with to have her family, is this really a happy ending for Danny? As although she has a family, she's also been coerced by the cult to be in this position, taking advantage of her emotional state and feeding her heavy drugs. It's such an interesting thing to think on. This is one of those endings that a lot of people will feel differently about, but ultimately, I find it fun to somewhat indulge in the triumph of this, as I was just rooting for Danny to come to a better place emotionally, and I'm sure a lot of people were. You want to see her win, you want to see her stand up to her crappy boyfriend and his friends, and for the people trying to justify or consider Christian's side, there's one deleted scene that I think really puts a stamp on what type of person Christian is, and gives us more insight into the manipulative nature of the relationship.
When you casually gift me an impromptu bouquet of flowers, that just makes
What
me think,
flowers?
how and when am I supposed to pay that back? Everything you give me is a reminder that I'm not doing enough for you in this relationship.
I mean, this scene can really sum it all up. It's kind of insane how toxic he actually is, telling her she's playing the victim and has ulterior motives for getting him flowers. I mean, it's insane what he can try to spin, but then again, it's something very real to look at and take from. And for some people, I'm sure this resonated from past relationships, so it can, I'm sure, make for a somewhat satisfying conclusion of how things turn out. It's just interesting thought and one of the reasons I do love this film now. I also found a lot of fascinating perspective on culture. I mean, there's so much of it rooted in the Hargas, and our eye as a viewer is much the same as the characters, just observing and trying to understand a lot of the commune's traditions. And while ultimately it turns out to be quite extreme and cultish, there's something to be taken away from how each character reacts to this situation. I think each one of them can represent a different viewpoint on culture itself. Mark has a clear disregard for culture, his viewpoint being quite self-centered and focused on the materialistic values. He blatantly disrespects different traditions and even pisses on their sacred tree.
That tree is tied to all of our dead. It's a dead tree, though. It's dead.
Joss represents an understanding for culture but not a connection. He's actually interested in learning about it, but only to his benefit, and he treats it with respect until he needs something else out of it for his paper, basically picking and choosing what he respects from their traditions because it doesn't benefit his studies, and he got clapped for it. Pele, to me, could represent the overindulgence of culture, eventually creating a toxic relationship with it, where his whole dependency relies on tradition. It's also basically a cult, so that's not good. Danny is of course a representation of the clarity and warmth culture could bring through community, especially when you're in a dark place. Embracing the culture around you could lead to a sense of home, and that's the good aspect of Danny's story, finding a family through culture and tradition. There's of course another darker take on it if we're looking at her perspective, but we're not going to get into that for this take. And finally, Christian was the only person I was sort of uncertain on how to view his relationship with culture, because although similar to Josh, where he'll use it and respect it only to his benefit, he's also a lot more accepting of the things around him. He will willingly go along with some of the extreme traditions just because it's not his culture and he's got to take in all those traditions. At the same time though, we can see that he's actually being used by the Hargas. They have planned and manipulated the situation to where Christian has pretty much lost full control and is thrown into some awful scenarios for their benefit. And that in itself brings up a fun look at the toxic relationships that can be bred from certain communities and outside people. And also Bear Man, rah! There's a lot of fun stuff I didn't get into, like the Harga's perspective on life, a representation of seasons. I absolutely love looking at different perspectives on existence and indulging in some of those discussions, so maybe I'll take another look at Midsommar later or just discuss it in the comments. As for this video though, I found a lot of the themes discussed on toxicity through relationships, culture, and community to be extremely interesting, and I can now say I'm quite a big fan of Midsommar. Sure, maybe it's not as traditional, scary, or tense as even Hereditary, but it offers a lot of insight and that's why I enjoy it. I'm extremely excited to see what Ari Aster has next for us, and eventually I'll probably do a video on Beau is Afraid, depending on my thoughts after watching it. Again though, thanks so much for watching, and leave your thoughts below. Have a great rest of your day. Peace.